As a young woman, I have been obsessed with fashion for the majority of my life. I, as well as many others, am considerably fashion conscientious. In fact, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, we as Americans have spent on average $1,700 on apparel alone. American sense of fashion has been evolving through the decades. The 60s were sort of a dry run test as far as fashion is concerned. The 70s were an experimental time in regards to fashion, and the 80s were time of maturity. Overall, fashion is a byproduct of cultural evolution. As I stated earlier, fashion during the 60s was a dry run test. Women during the 60s had a large baby boom population because the soldiers were coming home and having families. When the baby boomers became teenagers, they created a very lively, invigorated pop culture. The Beatles were taking over. It was very fun to be a teenager in the 60s. Women during this decade had a hard time coming out of the conservative cocoon, but when they did, they thrived. There were these little shops called boutiques that were specifically tailored to women of this generation. This is a generation that came up with leather boots, mini skirts, and fake eyelashes. Women during this age also wore a lot of eye makeup. Men, on the other hand, began the metamorphosis into disco fever. This is the generation that came up with the craziness of polyester suits. Men also liked to experiment with their facial hair. Anything went. More was better in men's fashion in the 60s. Men also liked to wear ankle boots, which is a precursor to a lot more craziness in the 70s. The 70s were more of an experimental time in America. There was a lot of change going on in the 70s. Americans were disillusioned because of the Vietnam War, and we were also going through the Watergate scandal and gas shortages. There was a lot of change happening in America, and our fashion reflected that. There was no structure at all in the 70s considering women's fashion. Hemlines could be above the knee to below the ankle. A girl could be seen wearing a mini skirt one day and then a granny dress the next. There was no structure at all. Anything went. There were a whole bunch of options in shoes: stilettos, pumps, heels, clogs, flats. Anything went. Anything was appropriate. It just depended on the mood of the individual. Men, on the other hand, men were just as flexible in their fashion choices. They liked to wear platform shoes, which is basically high heels for men. And a typical closet of a man in the 70s looked like a rainbow. They had everything from rosy red to checkers and stripes. Men liked to experiment with fashion during this age. The 80s, however, was like a spin-off from the 90s, but they were more materialistic. The United States was going through its own corporate phase, and there were a lot more women in the workforce during the 80s as well. So since there were a lot more women in the workforce, women needed their own power suit. This is the generation that came up with large shoulder pads. Big hair was also very popular with women in the 80s, and there was a lot of moves to prove it. Men, on the other hand, did virtual 360. They became extremely conservative. They wore new colors, and instead of wearing platforms, they wore loafers and Oxford instead. I still embrace fashion. I'm still a lover of everything fashion, no matter how tacky or gaudy our sense of fashion may have been. Fashion in the 60s, 70s, and 80s reflect American culture. For better or for worse, it's a part of our history.